Hello everyone, welcome to our channel of confession and cheating stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and enable the bell notification to increase engagement before we move on to our video. Let's move on to our video. Life could never have dealt me such a heavy blow. He accompanied a 20-year-old young man. I thought I couldn't breathe because of the intensity of the pain I was experiencing. Betrayal burned inside me like an unquenchable fire. At first, I thought that something like this had happened before in a house full of laughter and arguments, but it was so quiet that the sound of the wind hitting the windows was like a scream. I kept asking myself, why did I do something to deserve this? I was surrounded by myself. I didn't want to see anyone. I was reluctant to talk. I was so focused on my work that I thought it would help me forget. But it didn't. My parents eventually left me a large farm with a lot of land and a few employees. Even though I was doing very well financially, money couldn't fill the emptiness inside me. I felt like I was broken into 1,000 pieces, and no matter how hard I tried, the emptiness continued. Surprisingly, I haven't been able to connect with anyone else since then. Sometimes at night, I felt so alone that I couldn't fall asleep. Staring at the ceiling, I would lose myself in my thoughts, feeling as if I were alive but not really living. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop it, even though it was unbearable. Desire. I could show that everything was fine, that I was self-sufficient, and that nothing frightened me during the day, but when night came and the house was quiet, desire, you devoured me, so much so that eventually this hunger would force me to make choices that could change everything. The various workers on the farm each had their own background, their own tasks, and their own inquisitive eyes. But if there was one person I couldn't stop thinking about, it was Manolo. He was a quiet, distant man whose presence weighed down the atmosphere. He was always serious and focused, as if he carried the weight of the whole world. A Manolo commanded respect with botshupas without saying a word. Although I never let them approach me, there was something about them that fascinated me. At the same time, I couldn't help observing their movements. Every time they passed me, I felt a shiver run through me, an uncontrollable combination of curiosity and desire. A Manolo was a large, powerful individual. The fact that they were reclusive and seemed to have been sculpted by hard work made me think even more. What were they thinking? How did they feel? Why did they always feel so alone? My thoughts were more and more consumed by these questions. Despite my best efforts, it was hard to ignore these ideas. The more I watched Manolo, the more curious I became about their mysteries. Over time, we became more and more tense with each other. This tension was not normal. Something was making me uneasy. We felt as if we were stretched to the breaking point, separated by an invisible rope. Even though we didn't say much, I got the impression that they were aware of this too, but it was only reinforced by their focused gaze. I made an effort to be resistant. I remembered that I wasn't allowed to date anyone there, but how could I help myself? Every time I saw them, something seemed to rise up inside me, a long-lost need, a dangerous curiosity that would eventually bring me back. I knew that this would lead me in an unexpected direction. I knew that Manolo was a secret that was drawing more and more of my attention, even though I was doing my best to ignore it. To be honest, I wanted to know more and more, even if I had no idea where it would lead us. Back at the farm, it was an ordinary day. The farm was almost eerily quiet, so I went for walks by myself to clear my head and get away from whatever was bothering me. The sound of the flowing river has always made me happy. I felt as if it was calming me down and making the grief I was harboring disappear. That day I heard a strange sound up ahead, like a strangled moan, as if someone was there but didn't want to be noticed. As I wandered, lost in my thoughts, without realizing it, I grabbed the rifle I normally carry on these walks. I hid behind a tree and remained silent as I approached. There, leaning against a tree, I saw him. I saw Manolo, alone, but not in the way I expected. They were taking care of themselves. I was completely unprepared for this situation. It had never occurred to me that Manolo, usually serious and taciturn, could be in such a situation. For them to be so helpless and submissive, it was as if they were someone else. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. I started to feel cold. Something held me there. I kept my eyes on them. Even though my first inclination was to run away, it was too much for me. I was not prepared for the impact of seeing someone so strong and confident at such a special time. I had no control over how my whole body reacted. I felt as if I was trapped there, mesmerized by what I was seeing, unable to look away. Every time they moved, my longing grew stronger. Even though I knew I shouldn't be there, something inside me wouldn't let me Suddenly, I made a small, involuntary movement, and they stopped with my footsteps on the scorched leaves. My heart was in my mouth. I was convinced that if they saw me, everything would be ruined. But I was lucky. They didn't manage to see me. They were so strong and alive in that state that I will never forget seeing them. As I walked home, I made an effort to forget them, but it was very difficult. I couldn't get that picture out of my mind, and I knew that day would change everything. After that day, I couldn't get the picture of Manolo out of my mind. It was like a movie. I made an effort to concentrate on my work and agricultural work, but the longing that developed inside me overrode everything else. It was not just a passing interest, but something that fascinated me. I knew that if I did nothing, this longing would suffocate me. I wondered if I had made a big mistake, even though I knew in my heart that I had already made up my mind. Every time I watched Manolo, this feeling intensified. I needed them. More than that, I wanted them to want me too. I wished they would stay. I needed some time alone with both of you. On the farm, I didn't want anyone to suspect anything. I didn't want to leave any evidence or suspicion behind. I intended to assign all the employees to a task that would keep them busy for long hours away from home. Except for Manolo, each employee had a different task to do that morning. Away from the farm, I created long jobs and gave clear instructions for repairs. Trying to keep my composure, after everyone was ready to leave, I said, "You will stay." I called Manolo. "I want you to help me with the part of the fence to the north, near the forest," I said, keeping secret what exactly I wanted to do. As usual, they agreed without question. They just nodded and started preparing the horses. Even though my heart was pounding, I kept it to myself. I could feel the silence in the field. When I saw Manolo arrive with the horses, everything seemed more real to me. I was on the verge of losing myself. In the silence, I told the horses that the only sound in the universe was the horses' hoofbeats on the dry earth. The tension grew as we approached the wooded area that was now a great attraction for me, and Manolo was oblivious to my thoughts. I knew that when we got there, everything would all change irrevocably. But when we got there, I dismounted calmly and took a deep breath to collect my thoughts. They were still sitting on their horses, waiting for orders. I understood what I wanted, and I was ready to achieve my goals. The only thing I wondered was how they would respond to the truth. As I dismounted, I felt as if I was holding on to the tension in the air. Unaware of what was about to happen, Manolo remained on the horse and watched me. Although my heart was racing, I took a deep breath and smiled calmly, trying to act as if I had everything under control. My plan was about to come true, but now we were here, and everything suddenly hit me odd. "Manolo?" I muttered, dismounting with more determination than I expected. As usual, they followed me without question. When I approached the destroyed fence, they followed me, waiting for orders, as if something was really wrong. But when I approached the tree where I had seen them a few days before, I couldn't stop thinking about that image and the longing it evoked. When I finally turned to face them, I blurted out the words before I could stop myself. They remained silent, but I could see their eyes widen for a moment, as if they were trying to understand what I was saying. "Manolo, I know what you did in those moments when you thought no one was looking." Time paused. The atmosphere seemed to intensify. I could feel the heat radiating from my body, and I knew there was no turning back. I didn't wait until they answered. I took a step closer. They stood still, maybe unsure, maybe surprised. But I knew it wasn't just about me. I could feel a glow of interest and longing. I took your hands and gently placed them on my body. I wasn't prepared for how their touch affected me. It was like an electric charge. Adrenaline was pumping through my veins and my pulse was racing. He didn't hold back, but he didn't say anything either. Manolo, always so strong and confident, was suddenly weak in front of me in a way I never thought possible. Even though he said nothing, his eyes spoke for him. I realized then that nothing would ever be the same, since the barrier that had always separated us had been broken. "I saw you that day," I said in a whisper. He couldn't help the hunger in my voice as he looked at me. He finally understood what I meant. It was about us, not about work or the fence. It had been building for some time, even if we didn't realize it at the time. I approached without hesitation. The heat radiating from them was seductive, and our bodies almost touched. What would happen next was predictable. When they touched me, all the control I had been trying to maintain dissipated. This was the beginning of something I had longed for. It was as if the world disappeared after that first touch. When their bodies made contact with mine, I felt something I'd never felt before. Everything I'd built up to defend myself seemed to disappear. I no longer wanted to be myself in that moment. The need I had been struggling to suppress for so long was something I didn't want to face. This formerly reclusive person now seemed as surrendered as I was. Every time our skin touched, I could feel how my body reacted to his rough but loving touch. I had no control over it. It was as if all the pent-up longing and lonely nights had finally been released. The fact that I didn't want it to end was the worst or the best. With every movement, the anxiety was increasing. It was like we were dancing together and none of us wanted to stop. Every second the rhythm got faster and faster. It was this intensity, this sense of distance. I was aware that doing something could have difficult consequences and that we shouldn't do it, but that was all that mattered. Only we were here, and only now. Our bodies fit together so well that it felt like we had been together from the beginning, and they were pulling me closer and closer. This seemed to be our destiny. It ached because the longing was so intense. I had no idea what hunger was, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. Every time I felt I was on the brink, it drove me further and further away. I was almost breathless from the intensity of the kisses, the touches, and the way they held me. It wasn't physical, that's all. It was more than that. I can't express the connection between us, but there was. Maybe we had suppressed our feelings for so long that we couldn't see the growing distance between us. But I knew that in that moment, my desire overcame all other thoughts. I was completely enslaved to it. I had lived without experiencing passion and wondered if I would ever have such a feeling of vitality again. But in their arms, all my doubts disappeared. I was still here. I didn't want it to stop because I felt more alive than ever. At that point, I didn't want it to go on forever. I wanted to spend all my time in that moment. The control, the uncontrollable need, was getting stronger and stronger like a tsunami. I stopped resisting. I was ready to let go without thinking about the repercussions or caring about the consequences. The only thing that mattered was that moment, and in that moment, we were finally surrendering to the relationship that had always existed between us. After those crazy weeks with them, I realized that I had changed. I wasn't the one who had been abandoned and cheated. I was in control. I was in control of my passion. This newfound power was accompanied by the desire to show the old burly man what he had lost, that my 20-year-old niece was still with them. With that young girl who made me doubt my worth as a human being, I was aware of that, but I was also aware of who I was. What's more, I was also aware that no matter how much time they spent with her, they would never discover what I had. At that moment, I had a strange idea, something that made me smile, even though it felt inappropriate. I decided to text my ex, and it wouldn't be just any text. What they had lost was something I wanted them to see. I wanted them to understand that I didn't need them to be wanted, and that I would be better off without them. I picked up my phone and searched for a picture of them, a picture that clearly showed me what they stood for. The power, the passion, and the feelings it evoked in me were all expressed in that picture. "Look what you've lost," I said without hesitation, my pulse racing as I said the sentence. I knew it was controversial. I knew I was playing with fire, but I felt I had to do it. They must have known it too. I smiled and pressed the send button. After I sent the letter, time started to pass more slowly. I thought about how they would react if they saw the picture and realized how deeply I felt for them. Shortly after, my phone vibrated and the reply came. They had blocked me, as I realized when I opened the letter. I laughed at the look of anger or perhaps shame on their faces. They lacked the courage to face the truth. They lacked the courage to recognize my happiness. They refused to accept anything less. They had shown that passion has no limits, and that they would no longer hide themselves behind what others believed I should be. Sending that picture, that small act, had liberated me. I was free, no longer bound by the past, and more than that, I was ready to move on because I was no longer subject to the opinions of others. I was ready to live my life the way I had always wanted to. My ex could hold me back, but I knew that uncertainty was eating them up. For me, it was enough that they constantly questioned what they had lost. During the weeks I lived with them, I was in a turmoil of emotions, and our relationship seemed to have reached a breaking point. What had started as an unbridled passion had turned into something so much more. I couldn't even describe it adequately. Their bodies were no longer the only thing. They were touching her. That's how they brought me back to life. They used it as a tool to erase all my past experiences. But it's more subtle, like in a story of forbidden love. Everything has to be kept secret. After all, they were my servants and I was the owner of the farm. No one was supposed to know about our affair. But it was all the more exciting because of the anxiety of keeping such a deep secret. The love between us grew stronger with every touch stolen during our time apart. But one day, something happened that fundamentally changed everything. When we were together, it was as if the outside world had disappeared. Our desires had overtaken us, and we could not control them. As we paced back and forth with such strong longing, we were not aware of what was happening around us. A distinct sound, heavy breathing, was perceived, but it was not coming from us. I kept breathing as I scanned my surroundings for the source of the sound. Then I saw them in a shadowy corner, one of the farm workers, hiding and watching us, motionless as if caught red-handed. Even when they were caught, they couldn't take their eyes off us. They had obviously been there for a while and were observing everything. Just then, something strange happened inside me. It was a new kind of adrenaline, replacing fear and shame. Knowing that we were being seen and that someone was observing our interactions increased my desire. The connection between us was becoming more and more intense. I had never experienced anything like it before, and it seemed all the more intense because of the employee's mesmerized gaze, completely absorbed in what he was seeing. After seeing the employee, Manolo paused. His eyes were undecided, as I had also observed. They were trying to make a decision, but deep down, I knew they shared the same feelings as I. Everything was more exciting because of the presence of the observer and his sharp gaze. It gave a new dimension to our relationship that I had never thought of. However, it now seems inevitable that someone must have observed the worker. The worker eventually came out quietly, but from that moment on I could tell that they were carrying our secret. In a strange way, this brought us even closer. Manolo and I already had a strong friendship, but now that we were more deeply connected, it took on a new dimension. We were even more caught up in this emotional storm because someone knew what was going on between us. From that moment on, everything was different. I was aware that we were taking a big risk if we continued, but I was also aware that it was impossible to stop. The longing between us grew stronger as the observer's eyes needed it. Every time we saw each other, the memory of that moment haunted us. It strengthened our bond like never before. The intense and secret desire that began between Manolo and me began to reveal its complexity as the weeks passed. On the farm, we had to keep our bond a secret, but the intensity of our feelings also created difficulties. When we met, we always felt as if we were on the verge of a border. What was below was unknown to us. Manolo, who was usually very controlled, started to show signs of nervousness. I could see it in his movements and in his eyes. We were more cautious that this unbridled enthusiasm could not last forever. But the situation was getting worse. Even if they refused to take ownership, I knew the secret was hanging by a thin thread, yet the worker who saw us in the woods never said a word. As the weeks passed, the stress on the farm increased. People seemed more concerned, as if they sensed something was happening, but couldn't quite put their finger on it. I was aware that if we weren't careful, everything would soon be revealed. It was only after meeting Manolo once that I realized how drastically my life had changed. Our breathing was still erratic as we lay side by side. I stared at him, reflecting on our shared experiences, feeling more alive than I had in years, thanks to passion, desire, and secret adventures. Shall we continue? The answer I feared was the pause that followed. I understood what they were thinking, but they remained silent. I knew they shared my feelings. We couldn't go on like this forever. One of us would have to make a decision soon, as we were approaching the point of no return. Later that night, when Manolo got up and prepared to return to their hut, I felt empty. I knew that this wild and forbidden love was coming to an end. We would have to continue, not because we didn't want to, but because of circumstances. As terrible as it was to admit it, I knew the end was near. The next day I realized I had to make a choice. I couldn't keep going back and forth between doubt and desire. I had to accept the truth. As real and overwhelming as it was only momentary. As painful as it was, I knew it was time to let Manolo go. It was time to take the initiative before everything started to fall apart. When we spoke, for the first time I saw the same anguish in Manolo's eyes as I did. Even though they knew it was the end, they were a little happy that they didn't have to make this choice alone. Our goodbyes seemed quiet, devoid of grandiose declarations or assurances. Knowing that what we had experienced was unique, we just looked at each other and decided it was time to move on. I went home both relieved and dejected, knowing that the remnants of a lifelong love would always be with me. Although I had no idea what lay ahead, I also knew that I was ready for the next phase of my life. This is the end of our story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the bell notification to get our stories before anyone else. See you in our next cheating story. Goodbye.